Hi, I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Welcome to Free Thought Matters.
Dan and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Free Thought Matters. FFRF is a national association of freethinkers working to keep church and state separate. We invite you to join us in our vital work today at ffrf.org.
Today's guest is the distinguished evolutionary psychologist and author Steven Pinker. I had the pleasure of being the first person to interview Steven Pinker about his new book, which is out just this February. It's called Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress.
Steven Pinker is the John Stone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. His 11 books include the bestsellers The Blank Slate, How the Mind Works, and The Language Instinct. Time magazine included Steven Pinker in its list of the 100 most influential people in the world today.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation has previously awarded Steven Pinker our Emperor Has No Clothes Award for making known his dissent from religion. FFRF is honored to call Steven Pinker our honorary president. I had the privilege of conducting this interview of Steven Pinker last September, just before he addressed the 40th annual convention of the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin. I think I've read almost everything you've ever written from way, way back. When was The Language Instinct? Back in
1994.
94. That was an amazing eye-opening book. And your whole career is focused pretty much on linguistics and the brain and language. And I'm still telling young parents, read this book. You're observing this, almost a miracle happening when you're watching your kids, learn language in that. But through your whole career of the Blank Slate and The Better Angels of Our Nature, I pick up like a theme of optimism. You tend to be a very positive, optimistic person in your writings. You tend to show things aren't as bad as we think they are. And you're writing another book. Is it going to continue that same kind of a theme?
It is, and it's somewhat of a paradox, given that I firmly believe that in human nature that we have been saddled by evolution with a number of nasty traits like self-deception, like tribalism, like authoritarianism,
sexism,
racism, magical thinking. But on the other hand, we have also been endowed with some faculties that offer us a kind of hope for redemption. We have the faculty of reason, imperfect.
You mean redemption in a natural sense? In
a natural sense, in the sense of we're not doomed to strife and poverty and disease and ignorance. Yeah. We have a modicum of reason. It doesn't work all that well by itself, but when it's embedded in institutions that enhance reason, such as freedom of speech, empirical testing, critical inquiry, it can enhance its own power. We have a modicum of sympathy, that is, we can feel each other's pain. By default, that tends to be applied only to members of our family and clan and tribe, but it can be expanded through the arts, through technologies of empathy, where we see the world through other people's eyes, through reason, when we're convinced that there can't be anything special about us just because we're us and other people are not. And so the circle of sympathy can expand. So my optimism doesn't come from any naive belief in the goodness of human nature. I certainly don't believe that. But with the right norms and institutions, we can magnify the powers of reason and sympathy that we were endowed with.
Would you say altruism itself is instinctive, or is that something learned? Is that a cultural?
I think there is an instinct for altruism. I think we naturally apply it to our blood relatives because genes look out for copies of themselves in other bodies. I think we also have a capacity for fairness and exchange and reciprocity and trading favors. By themselves, that isn't enough for a large-scale society to be homogeneous. But it does give us the seeds that we can plant and that can grow, and through norms such as the rule of law, we can figure out ways to get along, even though left to our own devices, what nature gave us isn't enough.
And you point out in your last book, and I think in talking about your next book, which I want to talk about in a second, that we shouldn't rely on the headlines, because the headlines in the newspaper or on TV, you say they don't really represent human nature. They represent the weird aberrations of human nature. How did you put it? You never see a reporter on a corner.
Here I am reporting from a school that has not been shot up, or a country that's not at war, or a city square that hasn't been the victim of a terrorist attack. Yeah, news is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. Stuff that doesn't happen is what makes life worth living. The wars that don't happen, the crimes that aren't committed, and also the improvements in the human condition that we see are gradual. There's never a day in which, or very rarely a day in which, something magnificent happens. I mean, like, you know, when smallpox was eradicated, that might be close. When the polio vaccine was proven to be safe and effective,
did you take the little pills as a kid? I remember we had to take those polio pills.
I got shot up, but then other kids got the same.
We had to get in line with
yes, the pink syrup. Yeah.
Well, and it worked.
And it worked. Yeah, so the polio's almost eradicated from the planet. But those are the exceptions, when something really good happens on Thursday, and so it can be a headline. More often, the declines in violent crime, the declines in death in warfare, the advance in human prosperity and longevity, they're gradual. There's never a day in which you see a sudden leap, but extended over time, plotting the numbers on a graph, you see that we're much, much better off than our ancestors, but the newspapers tend not to report it because it never happens in a flash.
Yeah, exactly, and it doesn't sell newspapers. It's not the kind of thing.
That is another aspect. Aside from the fact that good things tend to unfold gradually, we are, as a species, consumed with bad news. For our entertainment, we like to see violence in murder mysteries and in war films and Shakespearean tragedies. And a lot of psychological research shows that we're very vigilant to bad things that can happen. We're in fact much more upset about bad things than we are cheered by good things.
But doesn't that prove the point? When you see a headline, don't we naturally say, like some parent does some horrible thing to the kid, I mean, you say, oh, that's horrible. Don't we instinctively say, what an inhuman thing to do? Don't we assume that the human thing to do is not that, right? We have a bed of goodness and altruism that the normal human being, that's not going to sell headlines by saying, you know, mama hugged her kid today, right?
Yes, right. Yes, that's true. It's the discrete events with a lot of harm done very quickly that are almost a definition of news.
And you've been questioned about your book, Better Angels of Our Nature, about, well, if things are getting less violent, well, look at the news. Look at Syria right now. Look what's happening. Doesn't that blow your whole thesis out the window?
Yeah, that's why the only way you can appreciate the state of humanity is to look at data. You have to plot them on graphs, and you see that there are ups and downs, but the overall slope is downward. Peace. The world is giving peace a chance. Through most of human history, war was the natural state of relations between nations, and peace was a brief interlude between wars. We can see this in a graph showing the proportion of years that the great powers, that is, the largest countries and empires, fought each other. And about 500 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Now they are pretty much never at war. Now, of course, there were two horrific exceptions to this general trend, namely shown in this graph, which shows the rate of death in war in the 20th century. And there are two unmistakable spikes of bloodletting centered around the two world wars. But contrary to widespread predictions that a third world war was inevitable, predictions that many of us grew up with, World War III never happened. And since then, we've been living through a period that historians have called the Long Peace. Let's zoom in on that. Here we have the rate of death in war since 1946, which shows a kind of undulating roller coaster, but one with an unmistakable downward trend. The proportion of people killed annually in wars now is about a quarter of what it was in the 1980s, a sixth of what it was in the 1970s, a 1/16 of what it was in the early 1950s and a 0.5% of what it was during World War II. Even the horrific tragedy of Syria, plotted on a curve of war deaths since World War II, which of course was sky high, it's been a downward roller coaster. Syria is an uptick. Since decline, the worst years of the war are probably over, and they are horrific. It would be great if the number of wars was 0. It's not 0, but it's less than what it used to be. We forget about the horrific wars that took place in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that had death tolls that were far higher than the Syrian civil war.
And in percentage terms, back in medieval times, it was even, as your book points out, very, very dangerous time to live.
There were some pretty horrific centuries before the modern era. The Mongol conquests, the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of various Chinese dynasties could kill people by the tens of millions.
Yeah. So how does religion play into this? Does religion help? Does going to church and praying to Jesus, are religious people doing a better job of combating our natural violence, or is religion contributing to it?
Well, over the long sweep of history, religions certainly have contributed to bloodshed and mayhem. There were the Crusades, the European wars of religion like the 30 Years' War, the Inquisition. There were probably about 1/10 of the people who've been killed in various atrocities over the course of history were victims of religious fanaticism. Now, you could say, okay, well, 90% weren't, but you'd kind of think that the number of people murdered for religion should be 0, but it's a lot. Now, this doesn't mean that all religious institutions contribute to violence. Many don't. But what we have to focus on is the institutions and not the supernatural beliefs. There are benefits to some religions, but that's because there are benefits to many institutions, to service organizations, to clubs, to international institutions. They don't need the supernatural beliefs, but when people work together for a goal that they can justify, then good things can happen. When people work together toward goals that come down from some supernatural deity, not so often.
Because a lot of religious people are doing good things, and their church is like the vehicle that they happen to be using, but the principles there, the values, the human moral values are common to all of us, religious or not.
That's right. I think many religions have become more liberal, more humanistic. They've downplayed their legacy of supernatural beliefs and dogma and authority in favor of universal values like life and health and education. And as such, they're kind of converging with non-religious service organizations like the Lions Club and the Shriners and Rotary, which are working to eliminate disease and increase education as well. And institutions that work to promote human flourishing are good things. You just don't need a belief in invisible entities to do it.
Well, I know in my town here in Madison, Wisconsin, there's a lot of non-believers in Madison, and we find ourselves marching in the same parades with our Christian and Jewish friends. I mean, it's the issues that matter. It's not the doctrine that matters. We're trying to solve real needs in the real world, and that's common to all humanity.
Absolutely, and that would be a benevolent direction that many religions have followed, and let's hope will continue to follow.
Do you think there is such a thing as an arrow of progress? You remember the French Condorcet, the French, he wrote that thing about he thinks there is this urge or arrow or something of human progress, and we're tending to see things like that as far as women's rights and acceptance of gay. We're seeing some progress through history. Is that an inevitable thing, or do we have to work at that? Is that a cultural thing we have to do?
I think we have to work at it. And Martin Luther King, of course, invoked the arc bending toward justice from Theodore Parker. It sometimes almost looks like that, because when you plot measures of human well-being, prosperity, nutrition, and education, and freedom, they do tend to veer upward. But there's no law of nature that says that must happen. There are a number of laws of nature that are pushing against it, such as the law of entropy or second law of thermodynamics. There are more ways for things to go wrong than for things to go right. They're the darker sides of human nature. By no means is progress inevitable. Progress is really the result of problem solving, of recognizing that there are ways of improving our lot and working together to implement them.
And once we've tasted it, once women have the right to vote, you don't want to give that up. You progress, and that's something that society is embracing and say, we like this. Let's try to hold on to that.
Absolutely, and we can lose sight of that, again, if we concentrate too much on the news. Because even though over the last couple of years there have been more headlines about white supremacy, about hate crimes, outbursts of sexism, still the standard has risen so much so that not even, say, the Donald Trump, who by many eyes has contributed to that, he is not proposing bringing back racial segregation, taking away the right of gay people to be teachers, taking away the vote from women. These are just, by now, inconceivable.
Yeah, they're givens. Yeah.
They're just givens. And so we look at the little deviations from that rising tide as signs that things are getting worse, forgetting how high the tide has risen.
It's a bit like the stock market. You know, if you watch the stock market every day, you can be really depressed for a while because, oh no, look at this. But if you do, like you said, if you do this, when you're in the middle of one of these downturns, you can still be optimistic because you know there's a general, whatever you call it, a tide or something that seems to be right.
That's right. There's a long-term increase and there are short-term fluctuations that are superimposed on them. It doesn't mean that there can't also be disasters, you know, Black Thursdays and great recessions.
Or in Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. But even with these hurricanes, look at the outpouring of empathy and charity and human giving and working that happened. We did see some looting. We saw a little bit of that, which is kind of, what is that, embarrassing or something?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's something in human nature that some people are going to go out and, but on balance, I think we saw a lot more stories of people reaching out and helping and giving money and trying to, you know, humans helping other humans.
There actually is a field called disaster sociology that looks to see what happens when people are confronted with a disaster. And it is generally true that when confronted with adversity, people do work together, they restore services, they tend not to panic. There sometimes is looting, but it's really more of an exception than the rule.
Well, teenage guys or something that are, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Teenage guys whose frontal lobe isn't quite totally
not wired up yet. Yes.
Your next book about enlightenment, is that like a follow-up, or is that going to be like...
In a way it is, yeah. It's called Enlightenment Now, and the subtitle is The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And it is an honor to speak about my forthcoming book in public for the first time in front of this audience. So I'm going to begin with some big questions. Why is the world filled with woe? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Now, these may seem like unanswerable questions, but all too many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. The world will be better when everyone obeys His laws. The world's problems are the fault of a certain kind of evil people who must be defeated and punished. One tribe of people is inherently worthy. It should have power and prestige implemented by a strong leader who channels its authentic virtue and experience. At some time in the past, there was a well-ordered state. Then alien forces subverted this harmony and led to decadence and degeneration. Only a heroic vanguard with memories of the old ways can restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? The point of my book, forthcoming book, Enlightenment Now, is that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, namely the ideals of the Enlightenment, also sometimes known as classical liberalism, secular humanism, or the open society. In a sentence, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Now, many people embrace Enlightenment humanism without being able to name or describe it. They are like the Moliere's bourgeois gentleman who was delighted to learn that he had been speaking prose all his life. As a result, the values of the Enlightenment fade into a bland background. They are just seen as the status quo or the establishment. And whereas other ideologies have passionate advocates. And I argue that Enlightenment values need a positive defense and an explicit commitment. The Enlightenment values center on 4 themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. I got the idea to write it when after finishing The Better Angels of Our Nature, which had 100 graphs showing that violence is in long-term decline. And then I started noticing that there were other measures of human well-being that also show improvement. We're getting richer, we're living longer, we're getting better educated, we're getting more literate, we're getting happier. And by we, I don't mean rich people in the United States, I mean worldwide. We're getting safer. Fewer people get mowed down on the sidewalk by cars, fewer people die in plane crashes, fewer people get struck by lightning. Pretty much every measure of human safety, well-being, flourishing is on the rise. Now that requires an explanation. It's a fact about the human condition that very few people realize. And I wrote Enlightenment Now, and I realized that the decline of violence is actually an example of, one example of many advancing fronts of human progress, if we continue to encourage ideals that made it possible, namely reason, science, and humanism. And by humanism, I mean the idea that morality consists in enhancing the well-being of men, women, and children, as opposed to, and other sentient animals, but as opposed to the glory of the tribe, the advancement of the faith, the well-being of the nation, or the expansion of the nation. As long as you focus on the happiness, health, and experience of men, women, and children, and apply knowledge to enhance them, success is possible.
So it's kind of like a species hygiene. We're taking care of us. I don't know if you're like me, but when I was a kid, we didn't wear seatbelts.
No, of course not.
We just drove all over the place, and now you would think that was totally reckless.
That would be like child abuse.
Yeah, and
no,
so
sure, you sit on your daddy's lap and
oh yeah,
steer the
I know,
car.
And sleeping in the back window. What if you'd hit, you know?
Oh yeah,
but,
making faces at the cars behind you.
But look at how it's so automatic now that we just do that. Look at the social benefits of just something as simple as snapping a seatbelt, or other measures that we take for granted in life. That
oh, absolutely. You know, fewer people get burned to death in fires. Fewer people drown. Fewer people fall to their deaths. It's really astonishing. So, and it's not. You can't point to one thing that led to these advances, which is why it kind of almost makes me believe in progress. Some of it is federal regulation. Those of us, those people who are constantly criticizing the nanny state and the overprotective federal regulations should keep in mind that we're 99% less likely to die in accidents than we used to be.
Wow.
Those regulations really save lives. But it's also technology. Often companies will make their products safer just because people don't want to be, you know, mutilated or suffer amputations from their equipment. Partly it's because of affluence. Once you are richer, you can afford safer products. Safety is something of a luxury. People would rather get from A to B in a car, and if they're richer still, they'll buy a car with airbags. So many things push in the same direction.
Well, we're out of time here. I think what I get from what you say and what you write is that without a God, without religion, we can still have hope in our life. We can still anticipate not an afterlife, but a better life, a better future. And
absolutely, the laws of the universe don't care about you, but other people care about you, and that's really our hope for progress.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It was really a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks for having me on. We are born into a pitiless universe, facing steep odds against life-enabling order and in constant jeopardy of falling apart. We are shaped by a force that is ruthlessly competitive. We are made from crooked timber, vulnerable to illusions, self-centeredness, and at times astounding stupidity. Yet, human nature has also been blessed with resources that open a space for a kind of redemption. We are endowed with a power to combine ideas recursively, to have thoughts about our thoughts. We have an instinct for language, allowing us to share the fruits of our experience and ingenuity. We are deepened with a capacity for sympathy, for pity, imagination, commiseration, compassion. These ideas, these endowments, have found ways to magnify their own power. The scope of language has been augmented by the written, printed, and electronic word. Our circle of sympathy has been expanded by history, journalism, and the narrative arts. And our puny rational faculties have been multiplied by the norms and institutions of reason: intellectual curiosity, open debate, skepticism of authority and dogma, and the burden of proof to verify ideas by confronting them against reality. As the spiral of recursive improvement gathers momentum, We eke out victories against the forces that grind us down, not least the darker parts of our own nature. We penetrate the mysteries of the cosmos, including life and mind. We live longer, suffer less, learn more, get smarter, and enjoy more small pleasures and rich experiences. Fewer of us are killed, assaulted, enslaved, oppressed, or exploited by the others. From a few oases, the territories with peace and prosperity are growing and could someday encompass the globe. Much suffering remains and tremendous peril, but ideas on how to reduce them have been voiced, and an infinite number of others are yet to be conceived. We will never have a perfect world, and it would be dangerous to seek one, but there is no limit to the betterments we can attain if we continue to apply knowledge to enhance human flourishing. This heroic story is not just another myth. Myths are fictions, but this one is true. True to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. We believe it because we have reasons to believe it. As we learn more, we can show which parts of the story continue to be true and which ones false, as any of them might be and any could become. And the story belongs not to any tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient creature with the power of reason and the urge to persist in its being. For it requires only the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
That was the distinguished evolutionary psychologist and author Steven Pinker, FFRF's honorary president, interviewed last fall by my co-host, Dan Barker.
Thanks for watching Free Thought Matters. On behalf of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, I invite you to tune in next week for another edition of Free Thought Matters.
Because free thought matters.